About 3 or 4 years ago, a really good friend of mine was down in Jamaica. And one night he was in a nightclub. There was an altercation, and he actually ended up getting stabbed right in the lower back. Gets to the hospital, the local hospital in Jamaica. The doctor takes a look at his injury and says, "Sir, you're going to need stitches." And of course my friend says, "Okay, go ahead." And the doctor hesitates and then has to sort of explain that he actually doesn't have stitches to put into my friend. They were all out of suture supplies that night. Also, about 3 or 4 years ago, I happened to be living in Denmark with my family, and my mother-in-law came to visit. And one day she was playing on the stairs of our apartment with my daughter, and she slipped and fell, and she actually got banged up pretty badly. We took her right to the hospital, and they took care of her right away. They bandaged her up, took care of her wounds, gave her medication for infection, and I might add it was all free. Denmark has excellent universal health care coverage. So I think what these two stories illustrate is how different Jamaica and Denmark are. There are some similarities between Denmark and Jamaica. They're both relatively small countries, small populations, relatively homogeneous societies, but there's some pretty big differences. There's actually much higher rates of violence in Jamaica and very low rates of violence in Denmark. Health care is not so good in Jamaica. It's excellent in Denmark. And in fact, on just about every aspect that you could think of, these two countries are quite different, from poverty to prosperity. Now, there's one factor that we might consider when we compare these two countries, and that's the matter of religion, or rather religion's absence, what we might call secularity. And if we go beyond just Denmark and Jamaica, but compare all the countries in the world, and we look at the most religious countries and the most secular or least religious countries, we find a pretty interesting pattern that's very similar to what we saw when comparing Jamaica and Denmark. And that pattern is pretty clear, that the most religious countries in the world tend to be not faring so well. They have the most social problems. And the least religious countries in the world tend to be faring the best. They're doing quite well. Sociologists who study religion basically focus on what we call the 3 B's: belief, behavior, and belonging. These 3 areas are the most accurate way we can assess levels of religiosity or secularity in a society. Number 1, belief. That's where we can ask people simply, what do they believe? What's in their heads? You know, do they believe in God? Do they believe in the devil? Do they believe in life after death, heaven and hell, that the Bible is the Word of God? There's also the realm of behavior. What do people actually do? Do people pay tithes? Do they go on fasts for religious reasons? Do they go on pilgrimages? Do they engage in religious rituals, religious ceremonies? Do they partake in religious holidays? Those types of behaviors are also strong indicators of how religious people might be. And finally, there's the matter of belonging. Do people simply identify as belonging to a religion, or a religious denomination, or a religious group, or church, or congregation? So if we take into account those 3 measurements of religiosity, we can get a pretty fair sense of how religious people are in a given society or country. If we take these 2 lists of the most religious countries and the least religious countries, and we start to look at standard measures of societal health and societal well-being, we find a very strong correlation that the least religious countries seem to be faring better, and the most religious countries seem to be faring worse. Let me give you 2 big examples. The first one, peacefulness in a society. Well, there's something called the Global Peace Index. And this is a study that tries to rank all the countries in the world in terms of how peaceful they are. And they take into account about 20 variables there: homicide rates, human rights violations, incidents of violent crime, warfare, etc., etc. Well, when they rank the countries, among the most peaceful countries in the world today, overwhelmingly they tend to be among the most secular. For example, Denmark ranks in the top 5 of being among the most peaceful nations on earth, and we know it's also one of the most secular. Jamaica is way down the Global Peace Index as being one of the most unpeaceful societies on earth, and it's also one of the most religious. Let's take another big example. Where on earth, what countries, what societies are the best places in which to be a mother? Well, there's an organization called Save the Children, and they've also created an index, a list of countries, and they rank them in terms of How good are these places for motherhood? Of the top 10 best countries, according to this index, almost all of them are strongly secular societies. And of the bottom of the worst places on earth in which to be a mother, almost all of them are strongly religious. Of course, we always have to recognize that correlation is not causation. Just because you may see some related phenomena out there, that doesn't necessarily mean one is definitely causing the other or completely causing the other. We know there's a correlation, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that secularity in and of itself directly causes positive societal outcomes like the ones we've been talking about. But I don't think we can count out this issue of religiosity and secularity completely. If we look at Denmark, 150 years ago, a very poor country, full of poverty, homelessness, people freezing to death in the streets. And yet, in about 4 or 5 generations, the Scandinavians have managed to alleviate almost all of these societal problems. And what was at the forefront of that was the social democratic political agenda, which set about fixing these issues of poverty and homelessness and hunger. And the social democratic political agenda was deeply secular in philosophy, in leadership, and in membership. And that needs to be taken into account. In fact, if we look at most secular societies today that are doing well, they're democracies. They used to be theocracies. And that shift to a secular form of government brought along many societal benefits. This is important information because a lot of people, certainly religious conservatives, often argue that secularism is somehow bad for society, that it's detrimental, dangerous. Nothing could be further from the truth. I guess here's the take-home message. If you think about it, religions have very clear moral guidelines and codes of conduct for their believers. Now, secularism also contains its own share of core principles and values, things like respect for individual autonomy, respect for human rights, acting decently towards each other, taking care of the needy, the homeless, the hungry. And what's so powerful is that in the most secular countries today, those values are being more successfully enacted and institutionalized at the national level than we're seeing when compared to the religious countries. There's clearly something going on here that deserves to be understood and deserves greater attention.